Welcome, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I invite Naresh Fernandes to give us the colloquium talk this afternoon. Naresh is the founder editor of Scroll magazine, an independent website, quote, covering news, politics, sports, culture, and everything in between, unquote. And it's really one of the most exciting and important platforms for critical discussions we have in the country today. Naresh worked for several media outlets in the past, the Wall Street Journal, Associated Press, and Time Out India. He lives in Bombay and he loves Bombay. He's written two books on Bombay. The title of his talk today is How Computers Change the Newsroom in India, or the Indian newsroom. It's very looking forward to it. And over to Naresh. Before Naresh begins, let me quickly convey to you that the audience will be able to key in their questions for Naresh to respond to after his talk is over. There's a comments box you might notice on the right-hand side. Please write in your questions there and Naresh will be able to take them. Thank you, Naresh.
Thank you, Chandan. I'm going to sort of read a text. It's a slightly modified version of a chapter or an essay that I wrote for a book that is called With Great Truth and Regard. A few years ago, Godrej, the company that was the last manufacturer of typewriters, decided to cease operation and asked a few people to contribute essays to this collection they were going to do about the typewriter, and it sort of explores various aspects of this wonderful machine that used to be at the heart of the journalistic process until not so long ago. And so this is what I wrote for it. One evening in January 1990, as I was wrapping up day shift duties early in my internship at the Times of India's Bombay edition, Lata Di Mello, the green-eyed firebrand of the newsroom, appeared at my desk and urged me to leave the building immediately. I saw my prospective journalism career go up in flames. I was midway through a training program at India's most stable publication, perhaps on my way to a full-time job if my performance during the month-long trial period was deemed satisfactory. To go home now, even though the shift was almost at an end, would give my potential employers the distinct impression that I lacked commitment. However, failing to slip away hastily could have undermined the workplace agitation I'd seen my potentially future colleagues planning ever since they'd signed in on the second shift. All afternoon, the newsroom had been filled with little eddies of journalists discussing strategy. No one had the time to explain their grievances to me at any length, but I gathered that they were concerned about management's attempt to replace typewriters with computers. This, it seemed, would throw scores of people across the company out of work, with no guarantee of them ever finding alternative jobs. I boarded the Harbour Line train home to Bandra from BT station opposite the office, choosing workplace solidarity over my unachieved future triumphs. It didn't make a difference. The next morning, the paper made its customary appearance on the doorsteps of hundreds of thousands of subscribers across Bombay. Though the rank and file had staged a pens down strike, a few senior editors had stayed late to put the edition to bed. Still, I couldn't have hoped for a more glorious introduction to the Times of India newsroom. That winter afternoon, it had revealed itself as a place where principle was debated with passion, where everybody believed that they rose or fell together, where journalism wasn't just a job, it was a calling that could change the world one keystroke at a time. The debates were still bubbling through the Times newsroom 5 months later when I was offered an entry-level position as a sub-editor. My disappearance during the pens down action had been too inconsequential to be noticed. Many of the events being discussed were echoes of arguments being conducted in the world beyond the stern stone building. It was still a few years before security guards would be accorded the authority to decide which visitors seemed presentable enough to be allowed through the doors. In the 1990s, the Times of India newsroom always seemed to be swirling with readers clutching raggedy cardboard files filled with evidence of malfeasance in the body politic or some personal success story they wanted to share with the world. Often the petitioners were trade union members or representatives of one of the sweaty activist groups with which the city was brimming. From the way they were dressed, it was difficult to distinguish the activists from the journalists. Both groups had an obvious affinity for kurtas made of khadi, buying their garments in October when sales around Gandhi's birth anniversary brought prices to their lowest. The uniformity of the clothes concealed the diversity of their concern. The housing rights agitations of the Nivara Hak Suraksha Samiti, the big dam critiques of Mera Patkar's Narmada Bachao Andolan, and efforts by various trade unions to protect workers from arbitrary management policies found sympathizers and sometimes strategists in the Times of India newsroom. There was much to keep the activist journalists concerned. Only a few months after the Berlin Wall had crumbled, upper caste students in Delhi were setting themselves on fire to protest the government appointed Mandal Commission's recommendation that affirmative action quotas for members of the lower caste be increased. A politician named L.K. Advani was leaving a trail of violence in his wake as he drove across North India in a Toyota van fitted to look like a medieval chariot to rally support for his demand that a mosque in the town of Ayodhya should be replaced by a temple. His Bharatiya Janata Party claimed that the mosque had been built over the exact spot on which the god Ram had been born, and they wanted this historical error rectified. In Bombay, workers were still reeling from the disequilibrium caused by the great textile strike of the previous decade, which had resulted in a sharp drop in the number of manufacturing jobs. 130,000 former textile laborers had been forced into the informal sector, eking out a living in sweatshops or as street vendors at a fraction of their previous incomes. These changes in manufacturing, it was feared, would replicate themselves in other industries too. For decades, economists had been arguing about whether a labor-rich country like India would actually benefit from capital-intensive technology. Creating well-paid jobs was thought to be the more efficient path to progress. Since the 1970s, a new element had been introduced into the employment debate: computers. While it was generally agreed that these machines could prove beneficial in some cases, it didn't seem wise to have electronic data processors replace humans as a matter of routine. This would result in jobless growth, a situation most economists concurred would cause havoc in a country whose most abundant resources were human. But by the late 1980s, journalists in Bombay knew that it was only a matter of time before computers would unsettle their world too. That was evident to anyone keeping track of global newspaper trends. In the United Kingdom, Rupert Murdoch had shifted production from a state-of-the-art press in Wapping, had shifted production to a state-of-the-art press in Wapping that relied on a new direct input system developed by the American computer firm ATEX. It eliminated several job categories: typesetters, proofreaders, and layout artists among them. Thousands of Fleet Street workers were made redundant. The Times of India's management was planning something similar too. In the early 1990s, some of its publications were still being printed on purring machines on the ground floor of its headquarters in Giti, in the heart of downtown Bombay. Passengers would routinely stop on the pavement outside to peer in wonder through the giant windows at the clattering cylinders and whirling steel belts. The viscous smell of printing ink regularly flooded into the newsroom 2 floors above, reminding journalists that we were only one part of a complex process that combined craft and commerce, ideas and industry. The factory-like nature of the enterprise became apparent at meal times. Members of all the departments, the printers and the typesetters, the peons and the ad executives, sat shoulder to shoulder on long tables in the canteen on the top floor to eat our subsidized rice plates. Many employees would return from work with the shared rumble of disquiet. It was rumored that the canteen contractor kept his costs low by spiking the rice with soda bicarbonate, an additive that felt diners feeling satiated, but which caused tummies across the building to growl malodorously through the afternoon. At the very heart of the process of producing a daily newspaper was the typewriter, from which emerged the material that fueled the beast. About 20 of these machines sat on the reporters' desks across from the sub-editor's lair, their state of efficiency reflecting the writer's seniority or standing with his supervisors. Typewriters with sticky keys or stiff carriages were, of course, allocated to the most junior staff. The value of a good typewriter was impossible to estimate. In one column, the legendary reporter Behram Contractor, who wrote under the nom de plume Busy Bee, noted that he had quit the Free Press Journal for an offer at the Times of India because he heard that the Times had better typewriters. Soon enough, he realized that it didn't. Two categories of staff were not assigned their own typewriters, the most junior and the most senior. Trainees would have to hang around until somebody had to go off to a press conference or interview, and we would borrow their machine. For the exalted assistant editors, on the other hand, people who had been trained in Oxford or Cambridge, typing wasn't even part of the job requirements. They had stenographers to whom they dictated their pieces or handed over sheets of foolscap inscribed with their masterpieces in longhand. Occasionally, the stenos could be heard boasting about how they had actually improved their boss's articles by making strategic changes. There was a great deal of ritual involved in typing out a story. 4 copies had to be made to go off to various parts of the Times of India enterprise. After carbon paper had been inserted between the sheets and the paper rolled into the carriage, you began by typing out a slug in the left-hand corner. This was the name assigned to the story as it made its way through the entrails of the system. And as the shift progressed, the subs could be barking into the intercom, asking the typesetters about the status of mayoral election or brothel raid. Each page was somewhat cinematically called a take. Nobody could quite seem to agree on the standard way to signal the conclusion of an article. Some reporters simply typed ends as the last line of their copy. Others used the phrase ends all. Some dinosaurs typed out dash dash 30 dash dash, a symbol believed to denote the phrase the end in Morse code. Soon enough, I realized that typing slowly was actually held up by some reporters as a badge of pride. Speed, or lack of it, was what separated thinking journalists from mere stenographers. It was displayed as evidence that the mind was engaged with creating original thought, not merely reproducing somebody else's dictation. Still, as anyone who's bashed out a piece on deadline knows, writing on a typewriter requires great clarity of purpose. With the clock ticking, there was no time to work on multiple drafts, so the entire story had to be hammered out in a single take, perfectly structured and free of grammatical errors or spelling mistakes. Much was made of the mystical power of words coursing straight from the brain to the page through the dance of the fingers. Some reporters swore that the hollow knock of the keys on carriage had been scientifically proven to stimulate the brain. But most importantly, the typewriter was central to the image Indian journalists had created of themselves. In the years after the emergency in 1975, when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had suspended the constitution for over a year, journalists had abandoned their once snug relationship with the government to begin to expose corruption and official excess, doing everything they could to demonstrate that the power of the press wasn't a mere cliche. They had been transformed, as one celebrated article suggested, into nothing less than typewriter gorillas. As word about a new device called a word processor filtered into the newsroom, it seemed indisputable that electronics would be the ruination of good journalism and good writing. A cutting from the New York Times explaining why this could happen circulated widely across the newsroom. The word processor makes it easy to rearrange, take from, and add to, the article declared. Words can be erased at the touch of a button and other words substituted. The reason for the word processor is change. But, the writer argued, if I think I could easily change the next word and there's nothing final about what I'm writing, then the nature of my writing changes. If poets thought words could be changed, the rhythm adjusted later, or that they could negotiate endlessly with the muse, they would destroy the sense of urgency that is the very life of a poem. Still, when the Times of India began shifting some printing operations to a new plant in the suburb of Kandivali in 1988, the poets of the VT newsroom knew that there was more at stake than just the elegance of their copy. In May 1989, a few months before the pens down action I had witnessed, the copy desk of the Times of India had sent the managing director a two-page memo listing their concerns about about the company's modernization drive. The company is going in for computerization in a big way, but the news desk is yet to be told of the new technology's effect on the work pattern, responsibilities, and workload of individual sub-editors, they said. To remedy this, they've conducted their own study on the impact that this could have on their lives. Since computers would force sub-editors to assume the additional roles of typesetter, layout artist, and proofreader, their workload would increase hugely. The subs predicted that they'd face new hazards that were both physical, such as straining of the eyes and the shoulders, and psychological, such as an increase in the number of repetitive tasks that they would be assigned. More troubling, they feared that the banishing of the typewriter would profoundly alter the nature of the social relations in the building, since computer technology would make workers feel more isolated, they said. The subs asked for some guarantees. Presciently, they warned the personnel department, as human resource departments were called at that time, against using the new technology to spy on them. Until fresh guidelines were framed about the altered work conditions, it wouldn't be fair to expect the subs to start any computer training, of course, they said. Over the next few months, even more memos would be circulated through the newsroom, amplifying and annotating the misgivings expressed in the first petition. The endangered typewriter had provided a spigot for fears about a variety of concerns to overflow. For instance, journalists were frustrated by job stagnation in the country's biggest English language newspaper. Some employees had been in the same position for 20 years, so journalists requested quicker promotions. They also complained about attempts to introduce a Murdoch-style contract system, which would make it easier to fire at short notice anybody who was skeptical about these new initiatives. The petitions were increasingly going unheeded. The Times of India's management seemed to be losing patience with the startling idea that democracy was as important within the newsroom as it was in the world outside. It had a radical vision of journalism to implement, and needed allies to help it do so. Where the paper had once carried news that helped readers make sense of their lives, the management now favored what they called aspirational journalism, which had a narrower objective, to make readers aware of the lifestyle choices they could hope to adopt in this new economy. The battle about modernization was still being waged in the newsroom in 1994 when four senior Times of India editors resigned to protest management's increasing interference in editorial matters. They decided to establish a media company that would be owned by by the journalists who worked on it. The journalists would achieve this by plowing back a portion of their monthly salaries into shares. I found their offer irresistible. In January 2002, I stepped back into the Times of India newsroom as a news editor. I'd spent 5 of the intervening years working at the Wall Street Journal in New York, but I'd always known that I'd return to an Indian publication. Though friends warned that the Times of India had changed a great deal since my last stint there, I'd ignored their advice against accepting this job. If there was one paper that mattered to Indian life, and especially the life of Bombay, where I live, this was it. On the surface, it all looked the same. The room retained its old decor with giant reproductions of classic pages on the wall. Uh, Under the veneer of tradition, though, the newsroom had come to feel just like any other corporate office. To begin with, the khadi had disappeared. Journalists were as upwardly mobile as the consumers of their stories and dressed accordingly. The unions had gone too. Even though I had been represented by union at the Wall Street Journal, one of the most energetic defenders of free market capitalism in the Western world, the Times of India had killed any effort by journalists to organize. Almost everybody had been forced to accept short-term employment contracts. The few old-timers who had refused to move away from the provisions of the government-appointed wage board still clocked in every day, but they were not given any work. They spent their 8 hours doing absolutely nothing in an airless office that everybody referred to as the surplus room. But nobody seemed unduly perturbed by this. The newspaper's circulations were flourishing. That May, it claimed a readership of 10.5 million. Each day, the paper would be accompanied by a lush bouquet of slickly produced supplements related to real estate, jobs, and luxury goods. The paper's cutting-edge technology allowed it to produce editions aimed at specific city neighborhoods or regions of the state. The modernization drive had greatly enhanced the quality of publication, though the same couldn't be said about its journalism. The owners had made it clear that news was mainly the stuff that filled the space between the items that were the real reason to publish the newspaper, the advertisement. With the Indian economy growing at more than 9%, a new affluent class was emerging. This section, estimated to number 200 million people, had suddenly grabbed the attention of producers of FMCGs, or fast-moving consumer goods, from around the world. Even luxury brands such as Gucci and Louis Vuitton had set up shop in India, encouraged by the fact that the country was home to the world's fourth largest number of billionaires. The articles around the ads, the owners of the Times of India decreed, should create a soothing environment that would enhance the commercial messages. As far as possible, unpleasant stories were to be omitted. The one time I was summoned to meet the owner, he told me that we should not report on the garbage that is frequently left uncollected in Bombay streets because of inefficient city administrators. Our readers have very difficult lives, he said. We should put a smile on their faces every morning instead of reminding them of their problems. The strategies that were deployed at the Times of India were so commercially successful, they would soon become the standard for large sections of the Indian media. As a result, journalists began to ignore the reality that 179 million of the country's population of just over 1.2 billion was struggling in absolute poverty, earning less than the United Nations mandated standard of $1.90 a day. The journalist P. Sainath says that this growing economic gulf between India's elite and the vast majority of its population has created a disconnect between mass media and mass reality. The power of positive thinking has since come to afflict vast swaths of the Indian press, and it's only been accelerated in the digital age. There's a paradox here. New digital technologies have greatly reduced the barriers to entry. Anybody with an internet connection can now start a website and potentially reach millions of people. In reality, though, it's much more difficult. Committing journalism is an expensive exercise. With the disruption of the old order in which private profit was often balanced with a view of the public good, it isn't clear how new online publications can be financed and sustained. As a consequence, some early digital publications attempted to reach the widest possible audiences by deploying the market-friendly ABC formula. They attempted to amuse India to death with a mixture of astrology, Bollywood, and cricket. In a reflection of the kind of people they needed in the newsroom, publications are increasingly putting out ads not for journalists but for content providers. A description that takes the emphasis away from the issues of substance and places itself instead on qualities that are cosmetic. It isn't easy to be nostalgic about smudgy sheets of carbon paper and the stinging odor of correction fluid. But I do miss typewriters and the clatter of workplace solidarity they had around them. Though we have gained the ability to erase our errors in an instant and reorder our thoughts effortlessly, in many Indian newsrooms, journalism has ceased to be an effort to transform the world. Thank you. I'll take questions now if there are any.
Thank you, Naresh. I mean, that was really Naresh. You should have been an anthropologist. I mean, I've not, seen a finer ethnography of shifts in technology and the shifts in relations among journalists and the kind of news that's being produced. I mean, it's really, but it was. I was enjoying it, Naresh. Thank you very much for the insider's interpretive account of a kind that we don't normally see by professional researchers. Um, Naresh, there's a question here. I'll just let you see it yourself. Just one second.
Yeah. So this is a question about fake news. In the light of profusion of media, social media, and the looming specter of fake news and misinformation, how does the common man know about what is true news? This is often this takes a bit of work because the people producing the fake news do everything in their power to make it appear as if it is credible. I have a couple of things I suggest to people. One is to decide which sources of news are credible and trustworthy, and keep going to them. And so that takes a little work as you figure things out, but it's then quite easy to tell which sources, places like in the TV, uh, the Indian Express, in the South, the News Minute, for instance, are all publications that place a great deal of emphasis on cross-checking and double-checking before they publish. So I would look at those. But also, if something seems to strike you as being completely incredulous and unbelievable, there's a good chance it may be. So the internet gives us the tools to go to fact-checking websites to check these things out. And so again, before you pass along a piece of information, I would go to something like Alt News or Boom Live and see whether they have run a check on it. Often they would have. Chandan asks, any thoughts on typewriters in languages other than English? I don't know a great deal about it. I just know that typing in Devanagari, for instance, is much more difficult than typewriting in English. The number of keys and especially the number of sort of characters that you have to combine is much greater, and it takes a lot of effort to type on an old-fashioned typewriter in, for instance, Hindi or Marathi, which is one reason that in the age of the cell phone, we have the Romanization of a lot of Indian languages, which is an interesting phenomenon. Or we have software that lets you type in Roman and converts it into, especially Devanagari, the script I'm familiar with.
Naresh, that wasn't my question, it was my colleague Giridhar's question, which I pasted here. But I have a couple of questions, Naresh, while we wait for the audience, to think of any possible questions. Um, what I mean, if you notice the role of computers in the Indian print newsroom and the Indian television sort of newsroom, I mean, can you make sort of broad observations on the different deployments of computers as a means of disseminating news?
You know, I was very skeptical when those computers first came into the newsroom, and I didn't use a typewriter. I didn't use a computer until the mid 1990s. To us, it just seemed like a worthwhile trade-off. To save jobs, you bang away on that computer. And if you've done it all your life, it wasn't a great leap to continue writing on a computer. I wrote a couple of book chapters on a computer in the early 1990s. And now I can't even imagine how we managed to do that, the number of drafts we went through. Uh, but the computer and, well, sort of combined with the internet is an absolutely spectacular technology. Uh, you know, especially with COVID, we haven't been to an office since March, and nothing has been disrupted for us. My colleagues and I, who are scattered across the country, always met virtually every morning, either on a conference call and now on things like Google Hangouts or Google Meet. And we've always worked in a sort of atomized way. And so the computer has allowed us to do that, to continue to talk to each other many times a day, but also to produce a website that doesn't require a whole lot of people. It doesn't require um, a layout artist or a typesetter or anything of that sort, all of the old roles. And so, yes, we are complicit in eliminating a great many job categories. Uh, I absolutely marveled at what the spread of this sort of new information and communications technology meant on right when lockdown started, where hundreds of thousands of workers, migrant workers, were walking home, and we could interview them as they were walking and making their journeys home. And they were sending us videos and pictures of them and their surroundings. This wouldn't have been possible even 10 years ago, I think. And so the smartphone has truly made it possible for people to tell their own stories, which of course then allows a lot of people to tell stories that are not true also, which is part of the
Yes.
problem.
Naresh, since you're a writer, I was just wondering if you had a chance to reflect on the prose of news. Has that been affected by uh, the arrival of the computers and the styles of editing that you alerted us to?
I beg your pardon?
No, the
Reflect on the
prose of
prose, did you say?
the prose of news. How news is written
I
about.
think PROSE rather than the pros and the
Yes,
cons. Yeah.
yes.
The prose has got so much better. Even
Yeah.
though we want to insist that standards are falling, things have got much better because it's so much easier, for instance, to begin with, to edit. You don't take a lot of time. You can reorder things, sending it back to some guy who's literally uh, casting this again in hot metal. But also because with the internet, young journalists and old fogies like me can now read journalism from around the world. Uh, we can sort of see the way people are telling stories in many different ways. To sort of date myself, in the old days, the newspapers, the foreign newspapers from around the Anglophone world were simply not available easily. So you had to go to the British Council or the American Center, and often this was a pilgrimage. People went once a week to look at what was happening around the world. The Times of India in the 1990s, when I was there, had subscriptions to the Independent of London and the London Times, which came a few days late and were put in a big open file in the middle of the newsroom. And people lined up one after the other to read these files of what was happening. I am now astonished that every morning I can wake up and read the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Washington Post and several British newspapers, but also Dawn from Pakistan, the Dhaka Tribune, the papers from Sri Lanka. And this is, I think, what's changed the post style. It also means that it makes fact checking so much easier. At one time, Bombay had an institution called the Center for Documentation, which was behind Regal Cinema, which had an enormous clippings file on all sorts of subjects. And often you would have to walk down there just to check one date or what happened to understand the sequence of events of something in a previous decade. Now you can pull it up on your computer at the click of a button. And I think that's changed the way we work for the better. Um, there's a question saying, uh, what are your views in the future of newsprint? I think all sorts of both the newsprint will continue to survive alongside digital alongside digital dissemination of the news. Um, I again was quite skeptical about how quickly newsprint would be overtaken. But I think the single most important event sort of that tipped the balance was the introduction of geo, and this is only now accelerated with COVID. I think newsprint, newspaper advertising in the last quarter, according to an article that just appeared in that wonderful publication, the India Forum, it was down more than 60% in the last quarter. And this was coupled with the skepticism or fear of people about actually getting a physical newspaper delivered. People thought that with COVID, rather the coronavirus, could enter their homes if they took the newspaper. All sorts of people were doing all sorts of crazy things, including me for a little while. Some people were putting their newspaper into the microwave, I was told. Some people had steam irons and were steaming their newspapers. Uh, when the print, the website, did an article saying that, quoting an expert to say that perhaps if somebody sneezed on your newspaper, your delivery person, and it then came into your home, you could perhaps get COVID. And the Times of India sent them, I think, a defamation notice for either 100 lakhs or 100 crores. I can't remember which one. But all of this has, I think, now tipped the balance again against print. Old people like me will continue to get it. I just find it so much easier to navigate a newspaper. Among the things that I find difficult about websites, including scroll, is the fact that all of the news appears sort of in a seemingly on a literally, and that's why our publication is named so, on a scroll, without being able to signal a hierarchy. What is more important than something else? Everything is the same value. That I think is a bit of a problem. And a newspaper clearly signals, the item at the top of the page with a big bold headline is more important than the gossip item on page 5 or page 3. And so, yes, some of us will continue to read newspapers. Will Zoom and smartphones change the way journalism will play out in the future? Yes, it already has. It makes it so much easier to interview people if you're a text journalist. And as you can see from your TV screens, everybody from NDTV to CNN are interviewing people on Zoom. And of course, that's led to some quite hilarious situations of people's children suddenly running into the frame or people's pets darting across their keyboards as they speak. Uh, and yes, I've already told you about how smartphones make it so much easier to gather material from people and speak to people across the country and across the world.
Naresh, as an editor of this, widely read, a digital news platform. I mean, it's more than news. How have you viewed the reception side of it in terms of how your readers interact with your news and how that a sense of the interactional angle between you and the news readers? I mean, what shifts have you seen happen in your own editorial strategies as a result? Because I know you're committed to responsible journalism and you're working on in the space that is indeterminate in the sense of you can't quite anticipate how it's going to be consumed. I was just wondering if there's a way in which you have tried to navigate this, this digital space in carrying out journalism that I know you believe to both be of a certain standard and also conform to the best standards of writing and reflection.
So the digital technology can be quite petrifying, and it can be quite a sort of sort of minefield to negotiate. So first, there is this pernicious tool called Google Analytics, which every website has, which tells you how many people are reading you at that point and what they are reading. And I hate to say it, but it immediately tells you that readers are frivolous. It is the sort of often it is the lighter stories that people are reading the most of. For instance, on our site right now, we have an excellent story about how khap panchayats are playing a very important role in sustaining the farmers' movement. But the story that most people are reading, are looking at, is a clip of Ria Chakravarti buying flowers and telling the paparazzi to go away. Uh, because of this, early in the game, we realized that a lot of websites will say this story has been read so many times, has been shared so many times. That is not something that we put on our site, and we don't even allow, or we don't tell our colleagues how many times their stories have been read. Because that, I think, would set up an unrealistic expectation. You could have spent days or weeks researching a story that is very important and that needs to be done. And even if it's not read as much as the Ria Chakravarti story, we will still do it. And it's not, it's unfair to put the burden of readership numbers on the shoulders of the journalist. The other thing is, of course, you're constantly getting feedback. Uh, the way that comments work has changed a great deal over the 7 years, and scroll turns seven in exactly 4 days since we started. Um, in the old days, in the old days, and I'm not talking about just 7 years, it was thought that interactivity, being able to hear from your readers immediately, would shape the kind of journalism you were doing. And it became very clear early on that a lot of the comments you were getting had nothing to do with your piece. That there were organized trolls, that there were bots sometimes that weren't even real, leaving all sorts of comments on your website. And so then many newspapers, many publications actually liked this. They would get people to argue in the comments section, which meant that people were spending more time on their website, and they would then tell advertisers, people are spending 20 minutes on our website every day. But actually, it had nothing to do with the quality of journalism. There were people fighting with each other, and often these weren't even real people. So now most publications have moved to what they call moderated comments. You have to register yourself. Your comments have to be approved. Um, we still have an old-fashioned letters to the editor's column, where we ask you to write in to us. Those are, I think, the most useful of everything we get. And then there are people responding to us on social media. But there again, it's a lot of trolls. And you can see the organized attacks coming. And so that's not very useful either. But yes, so we know that there are a lot of interested readers out there. It's just difficult to sort through who is genuine and who has a point to make, and who is motivated, or who isn't even real. Chandan, I think your mic is muted. I can't quite hear you.
Yeah, sorry. It was muted. Sorry, Naresh. Thank you. No, there's a feeling component to news consumption when you read news or when you watch television. Outside of any particular content, it's just that ontologically, at the level of being, you feel at ease. That this is a paper that I would like to be reading. And this is and in recent times it's been successfully ideologized, the words and what a paper comes to stand for. In the US, people turn on Fox and just relax. This is the news I want to watch, and regardless of anything else. And there is something about the colors, the sound, and the aesthetics that just put them at ease. And as an editor of Scroll, I was just wondering how you've tried to not allow Scroll to seem like it belongs to this camp or that camp, which people are invested in making you appear also. Or in other ways, I mean, have you tried? I mean, what do you do to not appear ideological? Um,
Yeah, it's a really difficult challenge. And, again, one of the challenges of working in the digital medium is that very few people actually come to your site, in sort of directly type in scroll.in or the wire.in. Many people find you, the bulk of your readers will find you because somebody's posted an article on their Facebook page or on Twitter. And so they're reading fragments of you. And the real challenge is,
yes,
how in that fragment do you
yes,
convey your character? Uh,
yes,
and so people often will, say you are anti-government, or you are anti-Modi or anti-BJP. To which our response is that we stand for the values of the Constitution,
yeah,
we also try to do much more reporting than analysis or opinion. And
yes,
we hope that that will convey and enhance our credibility. But yeah, we believe in reflecting other voices rather than letting you hear our own boring voice.
Naresh, I think the freeze, the frame froze for a quick. The last sentence, I think, couldn't be heard.
Yeah, no, what I said is we try to get you to in school to see other people's voices reflected, and the voices of the people who are affected by
Okay.
government policy, by the decisions made by people on high, rather than conveying the voices of the powerful or letting you hear our own boring voices.
Naresh, early on in your talk, it was lovely to hear you talk about how the physical interactions in the days of the typewriter allowed for a certain solidarity to emerge among the journalists, and that gradually eroded with newer technologies. As someone who's sensitive to the value of that element in the workspace, how have you managed to to weave it in to the scroll workspace?
Yeah, no, so I'm not sure whether our workspace manages to reflect that quite as well, and now we're all sort of isolated. But I think the
Yeah.
key to this is just going out and talking to as many people from as many different walks of life as possible, uh, and to have our own views challenged, because that helps us think our own positions through. That's a very difficult thing because in India, in this decade, most people are shouting, and it's quite difficult to actually listen to sane, rational, well-argued points of view on either side. And so that's been the real challenge to be able to listen to what views that we would automatically reject, uh, trying to take them aboard, listen to them with some empathy, even as we realize that this is the path to doom.
So Naresh, you mentioned that your the score will soon turn 7. I was just wondering, looking back, if you could see what are the big shifts that you notice in terms of editorial decisions and in terms of how the character may have evolved over the last 7 years.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but when we started, it was really trial and error. We started
Yeah.
with two or three people around the table, and we sort of made it up as we went along. We started out decide our sort of mission statement, so to speak, is that we would cover the news that matters and the things that make life worth living. So we were going
Yes.
to pay as much emphasis or place as much emphasis on culture and the arts as
Yes.
we were going to on politics and on sort of social reportage. And I think that sort of guided us all the way through. Uh, and yeah, sort of we realized that there are lots of eager young reporters out there who are passionate and committed to telling the stories of changing India. And no newsroom is large enough to accommodate all of them. But we're fortunate to have had colleagues who are really committed to the idea of journalism and the idea that journalism can change India and the world.
Yeah, Naresh, the final question from my side. I mean, this is almost a cliched question, but I think I would still want to hear what you will respond to this in terms of looking ahead, the years to come. The challenges that you've encountered in the last 7 years. What do you envision for Scroll's journey in the immediate future? I mean, it's not the
Well, it's clear that sort of the scroll and other independent, our colleagues in the independent media space will face great challenges. Uh, there has been an attack on all autonomous institutions over the last 6 years. And the independent media cannot exist alone without the support and protection of all of these institutions working in tandem. We just saw this great change in the US, and that's because all of the institutions played the role they were supposed to. The judiciary, the other parts of the legal system, the law officers, and the press. The press couldn't have done this alone, but that said, uh, things like the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of them have been committed to safeguarding the institution at great peril, sometimes even physical. And so I think that is sort of the framework that we will have to be aware of as we go ahead, of crumbling autonomy and crumbling protections that are rightfully accorded to us.
Thanks a lot, Naresh. It was terrific to hear you talk and the engaged responses after the talk. We've come to the end of the colloquium session this afternoon. I mean, I don't see any more questions on the chat box, which is fine. But Naresh, I mean, if there's anything that you feel like a point you would like to elaborate or revisit in your talk, you could do so now.
No,
Um,
thank you all for listening,
mm.
and I will end with a pitch that you recognize the value of independent media, and that you continue to support all of us, comrades in arms.
Thank you so much, Naresh. Thank you for taking time off and being with us this afternoon. It was great listening to you, and we'll keep reading Scroll. Uh, Thank you.